In the winter of 1897, a man walked out of the Pennsylvania wilderness after 11 days missing, alive, unharmed, but utterly silent. His name was Thomas Welker, 42 years old, a surveyor by trade, a husband, a father of 3, known throughout the coal towns of Clearfield County as a man of routine, precision, and few words. The kind of man who measured distances for a living and never strayed from the path. But on the morning of December 4th, 1897, Thomas Welker disappeared into the frozen woods near the Moshannon Creek, and when he returned, he would not say where he had been. The archives are thin. A few newspaper clippings, a handful of letters, a coroner's report that raises more questions than it answers. What survives is a portrait of silence, of a man who came back changed, and a family that would never speak of it again. This is not a ghost story. There are no phantoms here, only the cold, the snow, and the vast, indifferent woods of central Pennsylvania in the dead of winter. But something happened out there, something that made a practical man choose silence over explanation, something that made his wife lock the bedroom door at night, something that made his children remember him, decades later, as a stranger who once shared their name. The town of Clearfield sat in a valley carved by glaciers and decades of coal extraction. In 1897, it was a place of soot-blackened snow, company stores, and men who descended into the earth before sunrise. The Welker family lived on the edge of town, in a narrow clapboard house with a stone chimney and a view of the tree line. Thomas worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, surveying routes through the mountains. He was good at it, meticulous. He carried a brass compass, a leather-bound notebook, and a pencil that he sharpened every morning with a pocket knife. His handwriting was small and precise. His maps were flawless. His wife, Catherine, was a schoolteacher before they married. She kept the house with the same quiet efficiency her husband brought to his work. Their children, Margaret, 9, Samuel, 7, and baby Ruth, were well-fed, well-dressed, and taught to speak only when spoken to. Neighbors described the Welkers as respectable, reserved, private, but not unfriendly. There were no scandals, no debts, no visible cracks in the surface of their life until December. The weather that week was bitter, the kind of cold that splits wood and freezes breath before it leaves your mouth. On the morning of the 4th, Thomas left the house just after dawn. He told Catherine he was surveying a stretch of land near Moshannon Creek, about 8 miles northwest. He'd done it before. He knew the area. He packed light, a canvas sack with bread, dried meat, a tin cup, his compass, his notebook, a box of matches wrapped in waxed paper. He kissed his wife on the forehead, told her he'd be home by supper. He never arrived. The first search began that same night. A dozen men from the railroad, carrying torches and lanterns, combed the woods along the creek. They found his surveying markers, wooden stakes driven into the frozen ground, but no sign of Thomas. By the 3rd day, the search had grown. 50 men, then 70. They walked in lines, calling his name into the silence. They checked abandoned mine shafts, hunters' cabins, the icy banks of the creek. Nothing. On the 6th day, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees below zero. The search was called off. The assumption, unspoken but understood, was that Thomas Welker had frozen to death somewhere in the woods. His body would be found in the spring thaw. Catherine did not cry, not in front of the neighbors, not in front of her children. She waited. On the morning of December 15th, 11 days after he vanished, Thomas Welker walked through the front door of his house. He was not injured, not frostbitten. His clothes were dirty but intact. His boots were worn but not torn. He carried his compass. His notebook was still in his coat pocket. He sat down at the kitchen table. Catherine poured him coffee. He drank it in silence. She asked him where he had been. He did not answer. She asked again. He looked at her, just once, and shook his head. And that was the last time anyone would ask. The town doctor, a man named Horace Pemberton, examined Thomas 2 days later. His notes, preserved in the archives of the Clearfield County Historical Society, are brief. Patient shows no signs of exposure, no frostbite, no malnutrition, no dehydration, pulse normal, Pupils reactive, affect flat, refuses to discuss recent events, no indication of head trauma or delirium, recommend observation. But there was something else. Something Pemberton mentioned in a letter to a colleague in Philadelphia, dated December 20th, 1897. The man's hands were clean, scrubbed almost, as if he had washed them many times, and there was a smell about him, not unpleasant but strange, like wet stone, like a cave. To understand what Thomas Welker became, you must first understand what he was. The records paint a portrait of ordinariness so complete it borders on invisible. Tax receipts, church attendance logs, a birth certificate from Harrisburg, 1855, a marriage license from 1883, the paper trail of a man who did everything expected of him and nothing more. But ordinariness, in small towns, is a kind of camouflage. Thomas grew up in the anthracite fields near Scranton. His father died in a mine collapse when Thomas was 12. His mother remarried a foreman who drank. Thomas left at 16, heading west into the softer coal country of Clearfield County, where the work was above ground and the air was cleaner. He learned surveying from a Scottish engineer named McAllister, who taught him to read topography the way other men read scripture. "The land doesn't lie," McAllister used to say. "It tells you everything, if you know how to listen." Thomas was a good listener. By the time he met Catherine Flynn in 1882, he owned his own instruments and had a reputation for accuracy. She was teaching at a one-room schoolhouse near Phillipsburg. They met at a church social. He asked her to dance. She said yes. They were married 4 months later. Catherine came from a family of merchants. Her father sold dry goods. Her mother played piano. She was educated, unusual for the time, and had planned to move to Pittsburgh, maybe even further. But Thomas was steady, reliable. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't raise his voice. So she stayed. Their first daughter, Margaret, was born in the winter of 1888. Samuel followed 2 years later. Baby Ruth arrived in the spring of 1896. Catherine stopped teaching. She kept the house. She read to the children every evening, Dickens, Scott, the Bible. Thomas worked. He came home at the same time every night. He washed his hands at the pump behind the house, hung his coat on the same hook, sat in the same chair. Neighbors described their marriage as quiet, harmonious. One woman interviewed in 1942 remembered it differently. They didn't argue, no, but they didn't laugh much either. It was like they'd made a deal, and they were both honoring it. Polite, that's the word. They were polite to each other. The autumn of 1897 was unusually cold. The first snow fell in early November, weeks ahead of schedule. The deer came down from the high country, thin and nervous. Hunters reported strange behavior. Elk standing motionless in clearings, staring at nothing. Flocks of crows gathering in the bare trees, silent for hours. Old-timers muttered about hard winters and bad omens, but old-timers always muttered. Thomas noticed the weather because it affected his work. Frozen ground made surveying difficult. The railroad wanted new routes mapped before spring, and he was behind schedule. He spent longer days in the field, sometimes not returning until after dark. Catherine noticed he was tired. He ate less, slept poorly. She asked if he was feeling well. "Fine," he said. But Margaret, 9 years old, watchful, told her mother that Papa had been standing at the window in the middle of the night, looking out at the woods. On the evening of December 3rd, the night before he disappeared, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with his maps spread out before him. Catherine was mending socks by the stove. The children were asleep upstairs. She asked him if he'd be working near the creek again. He nodded. She asked if he'd be careful. He looked up at her then, just for a moment, and something in his expression made her set down her needle. "Thomas, it's nothing," he said. But it wasn't nothing. She could see that. "The woods feel different this year," he said quietly. "Bigger." She waited, like they go on further than they used to. Catherine didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She picked up her mending. Thomas folded his maps, and the next morning he left. What we know about December 4th, 1897, comes from fragments. Thomas was seen by a railroad worker named Jack Dorsey around 7:30 that morning, walking northwest along the logging road toward Moshannon Creek. Dorsey waved. Thomas waved back. He was seen again, 2 hours later, by a trapper named Eugene Kloss, who was checking his lines near the creek. Kloss said Thomas was setting stakes, measuring distances, writing in his notebook. Normal work. Nothing unusual. Kloss asked if he wanted coffee from his thermos. Thomas declined politely. That was the last confirmed sighting. But there was one more account. Unconfirmed. Unreliable, perhaps. A boy named Peter Novak, age 11, told his father he saw the surveyor man near the old lumber camp around noon. The camp had been abandoned for 3 years. Rotting shacks, rusted equipment, a collapsed cookhouse. Peter said the man was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking into the trees. Just standing. Not moving. Not working. Peter called out to him, but the man didn't turn around. Peter's father dismissed it. The boy was probably mistaken. It was someone else, or no one at all. But Peter insisted. Years later, in a letter written in 1954, he still insisted. It was him. I know it was. And he was listening to something. I don't know how I knew, but I did. He was listening. The woods in December are not silent. They crack. They settle. Ice shifts on the branches. Snow slides from pine boughs and hits the ground with a soft thud. Ravens call. The wind moves through the bare oaks like breath through teeth. But on December 4th, 1897, according to the few scattered accounts that survive, the woods near Moshannon Creek were different. Eugene Kloss, the trapper, mentioned it in his statement to the sheriff. He said the forest felt held. That's the word he used. Held. Like the air was waiting for something. He finished checking his traps early that day, went home before sunset. He didn't say why. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Thomas Welker should have been heading back. The winter sun sets early in Pennsylvania. By 4:30, the light is gone. By 5, the temperature drops fast. Thomas knew this. He'd surveyed these woods for years. He understood cold. He understood darkness. But he did not come home. Catherine lit the lamps at 5:30. She set the table. She told the children to wash their hands. By 6, the food was getting cold. By 7, she sent Margaret upstairs with the younger ones. By 8, she put on her coat and walked to the neighbor's house. John Haverford, a railroad foreman, organized the first search. 10 men with lanterns and oil torches. They started at the logging road and worked their way toward the creek, calling Thomas's name into the dark. The snow had started again. Soft, windless, the kind that muffles sound. They found his survey stakes, his last measurements, written in the dirt with a stick. The marks were fresh, but no footprints led away from them. That detail troubled the searchers more than they admitted. Snow had been falling since noon. Steady, but light. Thomas's tracks should have been visible, at least partially, but there was nothing. One man suggested he'd walked along the creek bed, where the ice would leave no trace. Another thought he might have followed a deer path where the ground was harder, but those were guesses, rationalizations. The truth was simpler and stranger. Thomas Welker's trail simply ended. They searched for 3 days without stopping, then 5, then a week. They brought dogs. The hounds circled the survey site, noses to the ground, and then sat down in the snow and whined. On the 8th day, a hunter named Morris Grant found something. A small clearing, maybe 200 yards from where Thomas was last seen. The snow there had been disturbed, flattened, as if something heavy had rested there. In the center was a ring of stones, arranged in a rough circle. It looked like a fire pit. But there was no ash, no charcoal, no burned wood, just stones. Grant stood there for a long time, looking at it. Then he kicked the stones apart and told no one. 40 years later, on his deathbed, he told his grandson, "I don't know why I did that. I just knew I didn't want anyone else to see it." By December 10th, the search had become a recovery operation. The assumption was death. The only question was when they would find the body. Catherine accepted this with the same silent composure she brought to everything else. She did not collapse. She did not wail. She dressed in black. She kept the children home from school. She waited. On the night of December 14th, She woke to a sound, a scraping, rhythmic, metal on wood. She lay in the dark, listening. The sound came from downstairs. She lit a candle, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, walked to the top of the stairs. The scraping stopped. "Thomas?" Silence. She descended slowly, the candle shaking in her hand. The kitchen was empty. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were shut. But on the table, clean as if freshly washed, sat Thomas's brass compass. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen with the compass in her hands, waiting for dawn. When the sun rose, she walked to the neighbor's house and told John Haverford what she'd found. He didn't believe her. Not at first. He thought exhaustion, grief, had made her imagine it. But the compass was real, and it had not been there the night before. Haverford organized a small group, 5 men, and returned to the woods. They searched the area around the Welker house, the tree line, the road. Nothing. They were walking back toward town when one of the men stopped. "Listen." They listened. Footsteps, slow, uneven, from the direction of the creek. Thomas Welker emerged from the trees at 9:17 in the morning on December 15, 1897. He was walking, not stumbling, not limping, walking. His coat was buttoned, his hat was on his head, his boots left clear prints in the snow. The men stared. Haverford stepped forward. "Thomas." Thomas stopped, looked at him, nodded once. "Where the hell have you been?" Thomas said nothing. "We've been searching for 11 days. Your wife? Your children? We thought you were dead." Thomas looked past him, toward the town, toward his house. "I'd like to go home now," he said. His voice was calm, steady, as if he'd been gone for an afternoon. Haverford tried again. "Thomas, you need to tell us what happened. Where were you?" Thomas met his eyes, and for just a moment, Haverford saw something there, something that made him step back. "I'd like to go home," Thomas repeated, and he walked past them, down the road, toward his house. Catherine was standing on the porch when he arrived. The children watched from the window. Thomas stopped at the gate, looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them spoke. Then she opened the door, and he walked inside. Dr. Pemberton examined him that evening, found nothing wrong, no injuries, no exposure, no frostbite. But there was something. In his notes, Pemberton wrote, "Patient's hands show signs of recent repeated washing. Skin is raw around the knuckles. Nails are clean, unusually so." When asked about this, patient stated he needed to get the dirt off. When asked what dirt, patient did not respond. Pemberton also noted a smell, faint but persistent, mineral, earthy, similar to limestone caves or deep wells, could not identify source, and then, almost as an afterthought, patient's pupils dilate normally in response to light. But when I asked him to follow my finger with his eyes, he did so, but slowly, as if he were watching something else, something I could not see. That night, Catherine locked the bedroom door, not to keep Thomas out, to keep him in. She never explained why, not to her sister, not to her closest friend. But Margaret, listening from the hallway, heard her mother whisper through the door, "Promise me you'll stay inside tonight." And her father's voice, low and strange, "I promise." In small towns, silence is a currency. What you don't say matters as much as what you do. And in the winter of 1897, Clearfield chose not to say much about Thomas Welker. He was alive. That should have been enough. That should have been a miracle. But miracles ask questions. And questions, in a place like Clearfield, are dangerous. So people looked away. Thomas returned to work on December 23rd, 8 days after he came back. The railroad supervisor, a man named Ernest Calloway, wrote in his log, "T. Welker resumed duties. Appears fit. Completed survey of Eastern Tract without incident." The word "appears" is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because Thomas was not the same. His co-workers noticed it first. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He ate his lunch alone, sitting on a stump at the edge of the work site, staring into the trees. When someone made a joke, he didn't laugh. When someone asked a question, he answered with as few words as possible. He was there, one man said years later. But he wasn't there, you know. At home, the silence grew thicker. Catherine kept the house, cooked the meals, washed the clothes. She and Thomas moved around each other like dancers performing steps they'd memorized, but no longer felt. Margaret watched them. Children always do. She noticed that her father no longer read the newspaper, that he sat at the dinner table and ate without tasting, that he went to bed early and rose before dawn, standing at the window in the dark. She noticed that her mother never touched him, not even accidentally, not even a brush of hands when passing a dish. And she noticed something else. Her father's notebook, the leather-bound one he carried for surveying, was gone. She asked him about it once. "Papa, where's your book?" He looked at her for a long time. "I lost it," he said. But Margaret had seen him writing in it the morning he disappeared. She knew he'd had it with him. "Did you lose it in the woods?" "Yes." "What were you writing?" Thomas stood up from the table, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her. "Measurements," he said, but his voice sounded wrong, like he was reading from a script. The notebook was never found. But in March of 1898, a logger named Hugh Brennan discovered something strange near the old lumber camp. A tree, a white oak, probably 60 years old, had been marked. Not with an axe, not with a knife, with fingernails. Deep scratches gouged into the bark. No pattern, no words, just frantic vertical lines clustered together on the trunk facing east. Brennan mentioned it at the general store. Someone suggested it might have been a bear, but bears don't scratch like that. And the marks were too high, too deliberate. The tree was cut down a month later for timber. No one talked about it after that. Spring came. The snow melted. The creek ran high and fast. Search parties went back into the woods, looking for Thomas's body, or rather looking for evidence of where he might have sheltered, how he might have survived. They found nothing. No cave, no cabin, no abandoned mine shaft, no animal den large enough for a man. The woods offered no answers. In April, the Clearfield County Gazette ran a brief article. "Local man survives exposure. Thomas Welker, surveyor, missing for 11 days in December, made full recovery. Incident attributed to disorientation and shelter in natural formations. Mr. Welker has resumed his duties with the Pennsylvania Railroad." The article was 4 sentences long, buried on page 6. No one wrote a letter to the editor. No one demanded more details. The town had decided this was over. But some people wouldn't let it rest. Dr. Pemberton, for one. In January of 1898, he wrote to a colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, a professor of psychology named Dr. Marion Hobbs. He described Thomas's case in detail: the missing days, the lack of physical trauma, the strange affect, the smell. Dr. Hobbs wrote back, "Your patient exhibits symptoms consistent with dissociative fugue, a condition in which an individual enters a trance-like state and loses awareness of identity or surroundings. However, the absence of memory loss is unusual. Most fugue patients cannot recall the episode. If your patient remembers but refuses to speak, that suggests something else. Fear, perhaps, or shame." Pemberton wrote back, "I do not believe he is ashamed. I believe he is protecting something, or protecting us from something." There is no record of Dr. Hobbs replying. Catherine's sister, Lydia, visited in February. She stayed for a week. Before she left, she pulled Catherine aside. "What happened to him out there?" Catherine folded a dishcloth, set it on the counter, smoothed it flat. "I don't know. Has he told you anything?" "No." Lydia lowered her voice. "Do you think he did something? Something he's ashamed of?" Catherine looked at her sister. Her face was unreadable. "No," she said. "I don't think it's shame." "Then what?" Catherine didn't answer right away. She looked out the window toward the tree line. "I think he saw something," she said quietly, "or heard something. And I think he's afraid that if he talks about it, it'll come back." By summer, Thomas had become a ghost in his own life. He worked. He came home. He sat in his chair. But he did not fish. He did not hunt. He did not walk in the woods. When the railroad asked him to survey a new route near the northern ridges, he declined. Quietly, politely, he suggested another man for the job. Ernest Calloway wrote in his log, T. Welker refuses field assignments beyond town limits, reassigned to depot inventory and rail maintenance. It was a demotion. Everyone knew it. Thomas didn't complain. On a humid night in August, Margaret woke to voices downstairs. Her parents, arguing, or rather, her mother's voice sharp and strained. Her father's, low and immovable. She crept to the top of the stairs. You have to tell someone, Thomas. A priest, a doctor, someone. No, you can't live like this. I'm living. You're not. You're hiding. Silence. Then her father's voice, so quiet Margaret almost couldn't hear it. If I tell them, they'll go looking. Looking for what? Silence again. Longer this time. Thomas. Looking for what? Her father's voice. Barely a whisper. The door. Margaret didn't understand. She was 9 years old. But she remembered. 60 years later, in a nursing home in Altoona, she would tell the story to a historian researching disappearances in central Pennsylvania. He said, the door, I'm sure of it. And my mother didn't ask what he meant. She just started crying. Quiet, like she didn't want us to hear. And my father sat there saying nothing. And I realized she already knew. Somehow she already knew. Thomas Welker lived for another 31 years. He died on March 9, 1928, in the same house where he had returned that December morning. Heart failure, the death certificate said. He was 73 years old. Catherine outlived him by 6 years. She never remarried. She never left Cuylertown. Margaret married a school teacher and moved to Harrisburg. Samuel became a railroad engineer and settled in Ohio. Ruth, the youngest, died of influenza in 1919. None of them ever spoke publicly about their father's disappearance, but privately, in letters, in diaries, in late-night conversations with spouses, they circled it, returned to it, like a scar you can't stop touching. In 1955, a graduate student from Penn State conducted oral histories in Clearfield County. She interviewed 12 residents who had lived in Cuylertown before 1900. Only 3 would talk about Thomas Welker. One of them was Peter Novak, the boy who claimed he'd seen Thomas standing at the edge of the lumber camp. He was 69 years old. He'd been a coal miner for 40 years. His hands shook when he spoke. People said he got lost, that he wandered around in the cold and got confused. But I saw him that day, and he wasn't lost. He was waiting. Waiting for what? The student asked. Peter looked out the window of his small house, looked at the mountains in the distance. I don't know, but whatever it was, I think it found him. There are no photographs of Thomas Welker after 1897. There are 3 from before. A wedding portrait, stiff and formal. A family photograph from 1895, everyone unsmiling in their Sunday clothes. And one more, undated but probably from the early 1890s, of Thomas standing beside a surveying tripod, holding his compass. In that last photograph, his face is clear, direct. He looks at the camera the way a man looks at a mirror. After he came back, Catherine put the photographs away. When asked why, she said they didn't look like him anymore. Dr. Pemberton retired in 1912. He moved to Philadelphia and lived quietly until his death in 1920. Among his personal papers, donated to the College of Physicians, was a file labeled Welker T. Unresolved. Inside were his medical notes, his correspondence with Dr. Hobbs, and one additional document, a letter written in 1899 but never sent. It was addressed to the Pennsylvania Medical Journal. In it, Pemberton described the case in detail. He proposed a theory that Thomas Welker had experienced a severe psychological trauma in the woods, perhaps an encounter with another person, perhaps a witness to violence or death, and that his silence was a protective mechanism. But at the end of the letter, Pemberton added a handwritten note in the margin. I do not believe my own theory. I examined this man. I looked into his eyes, and what I saw there was not trauma. It was vigilance. He was not protecting himself. He was protecting us. The letter was never mailed. Pemberton had crossed out the last paragraph and written one word at the bottom of the page: unwise. In the summer of 1963, a team of forestry surveyors was mapping old-growth timber near Moshannon Creek. They were using new equipment, aerial photographs. topographic analysis. One surveyor noticed something odd. In a remote section of forest roughly 2 miles from where Thomas Welker was last seen, there was a depression in the ground, circular, about 20 feet across. The trees surrounding it were younger, maybe 60 years old, while the rest of the forest was over 100. It looked like something had cleared that spot, and then the forest had grown back. The surveyor marked it on his map, made a note to investigate, but when the team returned the following week, they couldn't find it. The coordinates were correct, the landmarks matched, but the clearing, or depression, or whatever it had been, was gone. Or rather, it looked like it had never been there. One of the surveyors, a man named Edwin Cross, mentioned it in his field journal. Possible map error, or trick of the light. Forest plays games with your eyes, but I swear, I saw it. He never went back. Margaret Welker Hutchins died in 1967 at the age of 78. In her will, she left a small collection of family documents to the Clearfield County Historical Society. Letters, receipts, a few photographs, and a single sheet of paper folded and sealed in an envelope marked not to be opened until 2000. The Historical Society honored her request. On January 15, 2000, the envelope was opened in the presence of 2 archivists and a local historian. Inside was a letter, written in Margaret's careful handwriting, dated April 1966. It read, "To whoever finds this. My father, Thomas Welker, disappeared in December of 1897. He returned 11 days later and never spoke of what happened. I was 9 years old. I didn't understand. But I am 77 now, and I have spent my life trying to. I have read every book, spoken to every person who would listen, walked those woods myself looking for answers. I found none, but I found something else. In 1924, my father was dying. I sat with him in his room. My mother had gone downstairs to make tea. We were alone. He opened his eyes, looked at me, and he spoke. He said, 'I'm sorry I never told you.' I asked him what he meant. He said, 'There are places the maps don't show, places that are only there sometimes. I found one, and I should have walked away, but I didn't.' I asked him what was there. He closed his eyes. He said, 'A question,' and I answered it. I asked what the question was. He didn't open his eyes again, but he whispered one more thing, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. It asked if I wanted to understand, and I said yes. That was all. He died 2 days later. I don't know what it means. I don't know if it means anything, but I know my father was not a liar, and I know he was afraid, not of what he saw, of what he learned. I am old now. I will die soon, and I am writing this because I need someone to know. My father came back, but something came back with him, not a ghost, not a demon, a knowledge, and it changed him. And I believe he spent the rest of his life keeping it to himself, so it wouldn't change us too. The letter is kept in a temperature-controlled archive in Clearfield, Pennsylvania. You can request to see it, if you ask. Most people don't. The woods near Moshannon Creek are still there. You can hike them, camp in them, survey them if you want. The maps are accurate, the trails are marked. The forest is just a forest. But sometimes, on cold mornings in December, when the snow is fresh and the air is still, people say the woods feel different, bigger, like they go on further than they should. And if you stand very still and listen very carefully, you might hear something. Not a sound exactly, a question, and you will have to decide, very quickly, whether or not to answer. Thomas Welker escaped, but he wouldn't talk. And maybe, just maybe, that's the only reason the rest of us are still here.